My name's Glenn Entis. I'm a partner with Vanedge Capital. We're a relatively new venture fund in Vancouver, British Columbia, focusing on digital media, so interactive experiences, game companies, but also gamification of non-game businesses. Well, I'll start by taking a big step back, is that, you know, for the last, certainly since I've been in the game industry, I moved to the game industry from animation in 1994, and one of the reasons I moved to games is I just thought it's a more interesting, the rate of change is faster in games back then. It just seemed like the improvement year over year in graphics, and particularly at those sort of moments when a new platform would came out and there's this kind of discontinuous jump in graphic quality. It just was such an interesting area that was moving so quickly. And what's always interesting to me is that when you go into an area where there's a very fast rate of technical change, you can pretty much predict that things will happen on an exponential curve, that it's the exponential growth curves that are driving the change. But where you can trip up is thinking that once you think you've seen the pattern, that you really can just keep extrapolating that pattern out. So in the game industry, there was the PlayStation. Then there was the PlayStation 2 era with also the Xbox. You know, then the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 era, and it was feeling fairly predictable. You could look at the exponential curves and say, this is where graphics processing is going, this is where memory is going. Gee, what will the PlayStation 4 be like, the PlayStation 5, and the PlayStation 6? And of course, that's not what happened. What happened is that in the game business, we always understood that as the industry grew, and as the sort of much touted comparisons to say, well, North American game industry is now bigger than North American box office. You know, there's all these comparisons to say, wow, this has really gone mainstream. We always understood in the industry that the number of people who really were driving that business, who really were paying customers of the game industry, was a much smaller percentage of the population than, for example, consumers of films or of music. And what happened in the game industry is that it's still the same exponential curves that are driving the change, but rather than going from, say, PlayStation 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 for games that are even bigger graphics and more immersive experiences and bigger explosions, something completely different happened, which was that as more and more people started to do more and more things digitally and online, there was a bigger part of the audience that was ripe for games as long as the right games were there. And as it turned out, that a big part of what is now the gaming population, in other words, women, particularly women from, say, 25 to 55, they really weren't waiting at the edge of their seat for who had the biggest explosion and what could the PlayStation 4 do that the PlayStation 3 could. They couldn't care less. That really wasn't what interested them.
Can you repeat the last word?
They really weren't waiting for the PlayStation 4 and the next big explosion. You know, what's the next really immersive experience? They were doing something very different. They were using their computers as a social tool. They were using it as a gathering place, a place to visit with their friends, to check in on their friends. They were using, and when I say it's the same exponential curve, it is. It was making computers more affordable. It was making bandwidth more readily available and fatter. It was making smartphones and now tablets more available and cheaper. So they were riding that exponential curve, but not to get to the next PlayStation 4 graphics chip. They were using it to socialize. So the next big wave of games turned out to be social games. Games that were very light, very casual, were not immersive, but they were things that they could do and share time with each other. And that's where suddenly the huge explosion came, because it tapped into a part of the gaming market that traditionally had not really been well served. And as a result, the video game market, as historically defined, is still fine. It's still a big business. It's selling a lot of games. Big immersive video games are not going away anytime soon. It's a very big and healthy part of the market, but it's not where the growth is, and it's not driving the change in the market. And with those casual social games, as you say, there's been a huge disruption in the economic model as well, where the old model may have been, hey, the next Call of Duty's coming out, it's $50 or $60, and you buy the game, you bring it home, and you play it. Now, Farmville, Cityville, Adventureville, they're free. It's free to play. You don't have to pay anything. However, if you want that special item, or if you want to save some time, it might take a couple hours to earn something, but you can pay a little money and get it instead. You're paying money for patience. Suddenly you can make transactions on the order of a Facebook credit here, 10 cents, $1 there, and it's a very different economic model. It's a completely different economic model. Oh, it's very disruptive, although, of course, different companies respond in different ways. In the Electronic Arts case, you know, they've really embraced this. In fact, with Sim Social, they've got, the last I looked, it was the #2 game on Facebook, but it's growing fast. They could end up with the #1 Facebook game, you know, possibly even within the next few weeks to few months. But that was from a very concerted and, you know, focused strategy and investment on their part to go after this. So they bought Playfish, they bought PopCap, they put out Sim Social. So, you know, this has been a concerted strategy for them, and it is disruptive because it's a big investment. It's a lot of money. Those acquisitions were expensive. It's a lot of money going after part of the market that was still growing and not necessarily profitable in the first year. And what's really tricky, you know, anybody crossing the chasm when it's a disruptive retail change, the metaphor I always use is, you know, you've got $4 billion of revenue sloshing around in a bucket. There's a pole across the chasm, and you've got to get your revenue across quickly because it's leaking out the bottom, but you can't run so fast that you start spilling it. And part of what that means is, how do you take a traditional retail business and then change it in a way that isn't overly upsetting to the traditional retail partners, such as Walmart or Best Buy? It's very tricky because it's not just changing products, it's not just changing technology, but it's navigating relationships as you start to move revenue from one model to a completely different model. And Electronic Arts, I think, is doing that very well. I mean, they've really done a phenomenal job on iOS apps, where they are, I believe they're the biggest publisher now, certainly doing very well in Facebook games. And then other companies really haven't focused on it at all, but the wheels are turning. What is always important to remind people, though, we had just had this conversation with somebody this morning, and we were talking about a different part of the market, which is DVDs. Are DVDs dead or not? And of course the answer is no, DVDs aren't dead. They're not going to be dead for a long, long time. But it's not where the growth is anymore. And that's the key thing. I think with video games, companies can build a very healthy business on video games. It's a great market. There's a lot of money to be made there. But it's not where the change is. It's not where the real growth is happening now. Yeah, I think so. And this is just speculation on my part. But I think what's going to happen is that what we think of as video games or the video game console is going to be essentially the kind of interactive face to the television experience. You know, one of the things I mentioned in my talk this morning is you can clearly see devices are evolving around social context in which they're used or the physical context in which they're used. It's not really about the technology needs of the device. And the TV is not going to go away. Homes are going to have the big screen experience in their homes. And I think to the extent that video console manufacturers and video game makers start thinking about what's that living room experience like and how do we make that fun and engaging for people. Not just people who want to be immersed in, World War VIII, but people who want to just have a fun social experience in their living room. I think people are starting to get very smart about that. They're starting to develop games that address that. And we're seeing with, for example, Kinect is a good example. I think there'll be a lot more examples coming out of things that just make the living room a fun place to be. The other thing that I think is just a given is going to happen is that all those games that are played, I'll just say in the living room, but the games that happen on a video game console, I think increasingly are going to be, those games will be one window into that world. But if I'm a player of that game, then I'll also be able to check in on my character or my status or my friend's status on my iPhone or my tablet when I'm away from there. So it'll be games that I can play on my phone, I can play it on my iPad, and then when I'm home I can have the big screen experience and maybe a little bit more richness and surround sound, but it's all windows into the same imaginative universe. Well, you don't choose to be an optimist. Nature just kind of builds you that way. So I see opportunities everywhere. But if I'm answering the question carefully, I'd put it this way. There are opportunities there, but do I think that is an area that is structurally made for great opportunities? In other words, do I think there's a huge tailwind that's just going to make it easy to find opportunities in that area? I still think it's going to be tough. I think it's one of the reasons it's such a tough area is that it's hard enough to make a great movie. It's hard enough to make a great game. Trying to make the two together, I've never heard of an experience where, wow, it's just easier when we're doing this together. Somehow, it seems to be enough overlapping problems, we're solving each other's problems. Usually, there's all the problems of making a great game or a great movie, plus the added coordination and critical path mingling that happens when you combine two complex projects. But the flip side of it is, of course, assets can be shared, and certainly mind share can be shared. When you've got a licensed product, you're basically sharing mind share, day and date releases. But the problem, I think is that a great movie is still telling you a story. A great game is still giving you the tools you need, the sort of putting the verbs in your hand to allow you to one way or another be a participant in that story, and rather than being told the story, to go out and essentially discover some part of that story yourself. And even if it's a complete illusion, convince yourself that somehow you're making decisions that are meaningful in the context of that imaginative world, and the great story that you're coming away with is your story of what you did. That's what a great game does. It makes you feel like you were the actor, you were there, you were doing something. And I think it's a very different creative enterprise. There are very strong creative people who've got tremendous insight into both worlds, but to a large extent, the great filmmakers are not the great game makers, and vice versa. So I guess that's a long way of saying, yes, there are opportunities, but do I believe fundamentally that convergence is the sort of logical next step, or these two art forms are destined to find powerful and economically productive ways to merge together? I'm kind of a skeptic on that. Well, as a practical matter, I think it's more the latter. I mean, I've seen a lot of pitches where companies are pitching for money, for example, and talking about their transmedia strategy. And very often it's either, well, transmedia sounds pretty cool and it's hot, so we're going to adopt that, and we can show you on the spreadsheet how we're spreading development costs, but we're going to have multiple revenue streams coming from all these different manifestations of the property. So on paper, it sounds like a great pitch. The problem is that I think if you look realistically at what most transmedia strategies turn out to, it's actually compounding risk. Because you've got multiple, you're basically, rather than trying out a property and seeing if it succeeds in the marketplace, if you were able to build a good game or produce a great film, you're saying, well, it's a new piece of intellectual property, and we're going to bet on the game and the film and the comic book and the TV show. We're going to bet them all at once. And if it turns out it's not a great property, it doesn't work, you've lost all the bets simultaneously. There is the additional complexity of trying to build properties for multiple media at the same time. I mean, it is taking what's already a very difficult, risky process and saying, how do we make it more complicated and more expensive? So here's where I see the opportunities, though. There are, I think, absolutely, when you know a property is going to be a monster property to begin with, it's a great opportunity for transmedia. Why? Again, what I said before, it's mind share. You've got a property that's top of mind, everybody's thinking about it, everybody knows about it. That's just marketing 101. There's an opportunity, but that is not transmedia in any deep sense. That's just kind of, like I say, it's marketing 101. You've got a public that's aware of this property and is interested and wants it. Why not sell Tintin tie-ins when the movie comes out? Why not sell Cars 2 merchandise when the movie comes out, do spin-off coloring books and games and everything else? But that's been happening forever. That's nothing profound. I think the other place, which is way more interesting and creatively an opportunity, are those few creators who really understand the unique new things you can do when you get different media working together in a creative way around one idea. The problem is, those are not money-making opportunities. Those are not reduction of risk. It's increasing risk, but with a goal of doing something artistically interesting or were important. I think one of the brightest people I've talked to, and this is Neil Young, who now is, had NG Moco, which he sold to DNA. He's now an executive at DNA, but he had a game at Electronic Arts that was truly a transmedia game, in that he really thought in a creative, intelligence way about how things like the fax machine, text messages, a lot of different types of media could combine to create a sense of conspiracy and danger and darkness around this game. And that was transmedia thinking in a really creative, different sense. But that's not usually what people mean by it.